Hi everybody, welcome back to the channel, and today I wanted to do a review of Berestechko 1651 from Snafu Design, game by Krzysztof Dojczak. Apologies if I've pronounced that incorrectly. Developed by Mark Fagaras, Oscar Oliver and Ivan Pratt, and artwork and graphic design by Eduard Altariba. And beautiful artwork it is too. So this is a small aspect game, Pocket Battles game, second of their series. I've got a number of their other games. I love the Snafu games, and Oscar kindly sent me this review copy to share with you, the listeners, and I've been very impressed, I've got to say. You can see here, small rule book. The rule book, as per my unbagging, runs to 15 pages, but the actual rules themselves probably about a dozen pages with lots of colour illustrations. We've got examples of play, very nicely set out, small little booklet there, easy to pack in your travel case. You've got a nice little reference QRS sheet here, talks you through the key mechanics, and I'm going to show you in a moment just a little playthrough showing you some of the mechanics and how they work in terms of the activations, melee, fire combat, and the morale, reorganisation, coordination tracks. Fundamentally, the game is a two-player game. I've obviously play tested it or played it solo. Looking forward to playing it two players. I think it will add definitely an extra dimension. Very simple victory conditions. You've got to eliminate 4 enemy units. So that's sort of ensures that the game comes to an end within that 2-turn time frame you have. And you think, 2 turns, blimey, that's not very long. But each turn is made up by multiples of what we call impulses, where you roll 3 dice. You will use 2 of them to activate units. Each unit in your force can activate 2 times during a turn. So there will be a finite number of impulses before a turn ends, and there can be 2 turns in the game. So you can work out as the player that each unit potentially has 4 activations. You've got to plan very carefully how you utilise those. How you coordinate units together to maximise combat capability, how you defend areas, how you defend units, how you ensure your morale stays at the right level if you're the Tartar player. So there's quite a lot going on here. Whether you're the Polish-Lituanians or whether you're the Cossacks and Tartars, you've got some interesting game choices to make here. And that's where I feel the fundamental friction in the game is. You can't do everything you want to do. Sometimes you can't do anything you want to do. And that's very cleverly wrapped up within this activation mechanic that I've just spoken about. I also like the fact that the units have different types of dice that they use in combat to defend or attack, which can make them slightly more erratic, but potentially very effective, or a complete failure. And other units may be a little bit more steady, more effective. Defensively, none of the units are particularly strong. Infantry, probably particularly in the Cossacks case with the tabor wagons, makes them quite strong. So they can form quite a decent defensive line for the Cossack player. The map is small footprint, about A4 size. You've got a couple of player aid sheets, again in this sort of small booklet format. I think you call that A5 maybe. I might be wrong. But production values, very good. I love the colour palette that you're using. You've got the blue and green for the Tartar Cossack forces, red for the Polish-Lithuanians. So very vibrant. They stand out on the map very well. It's easy to see at a glance what you're playing with, what you're using. Counter count is fine, not too bad at all. There's no stacking. potentially in this game, so you're never going to have more than 2, maximum 3 on some units counters on a hex. Hexes are quite big. Counters are more than adequate for the game, bearing in mind the price point of this game. Very, very good value for money. You can see in there the different colours, which again I'll show you in the little playthrough mock-up that I'll do in a moment. So overall, yeah, I've been really impressed. For me, there's some very new mechanics I haven't seen in other board tabletop games, and I think, bearing in mind this is meant to be a very small footprint, fast playing game, it's quite refreshing to see that they haven't fallen back on the same hex and counter style designs that we see in other games. So you take the game I showed you a few weeks ago, which I can't pronounce, but basically it was the Finns versus the Germans, or Russians versus the Germans. It was a wonderful game, World War II game, small footprint, lovely game, but it was quite traditional in its approach. And there's nothing wrong with that, because I do like the traditional hex and counter games, but I just felt this was something a little bit different, and I'd like to see how this is used in other games in this series, because it was just that little bit different. You need to manage your resources quite carefully throughout the game. You build up your coordination tracks or your reorganization tracks, which will allow you to do things in game. In the Tartar player's case, trying to protect your morale so that your forces don't retreat off the table. Bearing in mind that the Tartar player has 4 units, Tartar withdrawal pretty much means the end of the game, and therefore that's quite a crucial in-game design, which gives the Polish-Lithuanian player something to think about with their strategy with the game. But also the Cossack Tartar player needs to think carefully about how much he commits his Tartars to the battle. And the Tartars have some very strong units, and if they're successful, then they can manage that morale quite easily. But if they do get caught or in a sticky situation, that could put a huge amount of pressure on that side's play. So lots to think about there. We've got things like Cossack wagons in here, we've got winged hussars, we've got infantry, we've got cavalry. There's quite a lot going on here for a little game, and I think there's quite a lot of replayability as a result as well, in the way that you could play this. Terrain, for example, on the map is minimal, but there are some useful terrain elements in there, which again can add some extra aspects to the game. They reduce movements, they affect how the defender can retreat or lose. That gives them that choice rather than being forced to be disorganized or forced to retreat. And it reduces combat effectiveness. So again, particularly as the Polish player, the terrain is more on their side of the map. They've got some choices there around the offensive defensive capabilities of their units. But look, let's set things up. Just show you a couple of little mock play ups of how the game plays. Hopefully it'll give you a bit more of a flavour and maybe strike a little bit of interest to go and have a look at the Snafu website and look at Berestechko 1651. Okay, so I just wanted to show you some of the mechanics in action with this game. First of all, I'd like to talk about the player aid sheets. So I'm just going to zoom those in a little bit for you to see a bit clearer. Now, normally each of the counters on the map have their activation counters up the top here, and as you activate the counters on the map, you will place these onto the top of the counter. So this one here shows in the middle that it's had its first activation, and then when it's had 2, you'll have both of those greyed out, and that means they can't do any more in this turn. So in each turn, in effect, these units can have 2 activations as part of your impulses. What you'll see on this unit here, it's a cavalry unit. It rolls d6s. It rolls 2 dice on attack and 1 on defense, and its resilience factor in effect is a 6. Whoops. Unless it's disorganized, in which case it would then be a 4. So this is quite neat in that it gives you visually where you are in terms of activations. On the rest of the track, so this is the Tarda morale track. It's important for the Tarda player to manage the morale to ensure that doesn't get down to 0, otherwise the entire Tarda forces, which are the green counters, come off the table. That probably is going to end up pretty much with defeat for that player. It's going to make it certainly very difficult, but there are things you can do here to influence that. So it goes down 1 if a Tarda unit is disorganized or eliminated, up 1 if a unit is reorganized, which we'll come on to in a moment, and +1 if a Polish unit is eliminated. So there are ways of manipulating that. Then you come down to reorganization track. So as you roll your dice, if you get the required numbers, which I'll come on to in a moment, you can allocate them to reorganization and build that up. You start with 2. You can spend 1 to decide as a defender to be disorganized or retreat in a combat. Give up 2 to retreat before melee. That can be quite useful to pick your battles. And use 3 to reorganize. So that's quite expensive, but it allows you to flip your counter over and put it back to full strength. The coordination track uses the same mechanic. Again, depending on your dice roll, you can spend it to increase the coordination. And again, depending where you are, you can add extra infantry units to fire combat, extra units to melee combat. That will predominantly be cavalry. And that's obviously only if they're adjacent, in addition to the main melee combatants, to add their weight of fire or melee combat modifiers. If you're infantry, you can also add an extra d6 for artillery if attacking or defending, and you can use 2 points to activate 1 unit for movement or combat. So if you don't get the rolls you want in your impulse, you could spend, if it's really important to activate a certain unit, you could spend your coordination to do that. So really interesting dynamic within the mechanics of this game. You'll see on the Polish side very similar. They just have a reorganization and coordination track of a similar vein. The key difference between the two is the morale of the Tartars as well. But let's come on to the map. So I've just set up a mock example here. This isn't obviously anywhere near all the forces in the main game. I've just set up a very small part of the map just to kind of show you some of the dynamics of things in action. So each turn you will roll 3d6, and what you'll do is you'll roll those d6, and what I'm going to do is change those to some numbers to give you a flavour of what you can do. So let's say, for example, this is the Polish player, okay, and hopefully that's lining up okay. So the Polish player rolls a 1, a 5 and a 4. Obviously this is a much reduced example because we've only got 1 unit on the board, and funny enough you'll see their activation number is 4, and I've made sure we've got a 4 on here. That would allow you to activate that unit. You have to use 2 of these dice in each impulse. So in this case 2, 3s, 4s and 5s will activate some of your units in your army. 1s and 6s allow you to increase the coordination or reorganisation tracks, which we talked about before. So in this case, the Polish player would probably use the 1 to increase reorganisation or coordination. There are counters for this. Again, I haven't got them out at the moment, but let's assume for the purposes of this, okay, that they're going to increase their reorganisation track. Okay, I'm just going to put the dice there for the moment, and they're going to use the 4 to activate the unit. Okay, so they've got a number of options. They can move 2 with cavalry, other than if they're moving into difficult terrain, which are these areas here, the woods, marshes, etc., when they will immediately stop when they move into those areas. Likewise, they do give benefits to units in attack and in defence, because they reduce the attacker's dice, but also their own. So it tends to be a little bit more of a stalemate in a defensive position. It's very hard to dislodge units, but I'm not going to do that, because I just want to show how this works in reality. So I'm going to do a really stupid move, and I'm going to move them into this area here. So they're adjacent to 2 areas, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to attack Haranka here with my cavalry, just to kind of give you a flavour of how the dynamics of the game work. So in this situation, as the attacker, I am going to be rolling, let's bring that over so you can see, I'm going to be rolling D8s for Kalinowski, and I'm going to be rolling 2 of those. Okay, so I would roll, we have a 6 and a 7 is 13. Okay, we would look over at our player aid sheet and see if there's anything we can use then. If for purposes of this we haven't got extra units there, we can't add any modifiers, so we stick with 13. The defender, you will see here, has a little shield, 1, and rolls a d6. So they only can roll 1d6, and they would get a 4. That would be a difference of 9. Okay, and basically all you will do then is look at this table here, and if that combat modifier is more than the resistance factor, which on this unit the resistance is 6, so it is, okay, and it's more than 2 times that, the defender will be disorganized and retreat. Okay, so in that scenario you would flip the counter over, and you would see now that its modifiers in the future, resistance, etc., have reduced. Okay, just an example. Let's look at it slightly differently. Let's assume that we've got a scenario where we've got this going on, and the Tartar player has decided to launch an attack against Kalinowski, and let's assume that he has 1 on the coordination track. Okay, so he wants to be able to use the additional unit here in the melee to work that melee to his advantage. So you'll see here he rolls 3 d6s, but he also then, spending his coordination points, he gets to roll 2 more d6s for Nossash as well. So he gets to roll 5 d6s, which gives him a total of 25, which is massive, because the Polish in defence only get to roll a d8. Now, in that scenario, they would be pretty much toast, even with an 8. So they would be disorganised. And if they couldn't retreat, they always have to retreat to their lines, and vice versa. Say there were units here and here, they would be destroyed. Okay, so that's quite straightforward as well. You've also got other scenarios with the infantry. And the infantry, let's say the cavalry are going to attack the infantry, like so. Let's just keep those out of the way for the moment. So the infantry would use a fire combat situation. And it's a little bit different here because it's just the attacker rolling. So the attacker would be doing melee, but if it was the other way round, the infantry would be doing fire combat rather than a melee. So let's assume that they are going to do a fire combat. Okay, and I just want to show you really how fire combat works. Again, they can coordinate attacks, but in this case they won't have any. They can do other things as well. So for example, in this situation, the infantry have a wagon. They have a tabor. Okay, so they're basically in quite decent situation there. I'm just double checking something on the rules with this one, because I've used tabors in combat. I'm just double checking they still get the same modifiers for fire combat as well. Let's have a look. Wagons double the resistance of the infantry unit. They also prevent the retreat of the infantry unit. So in this situation, the tabor won't help the firing, but it will help protect that infantry unit from attack. So for firing, let's assume we're firing, it's a d6 times 2, and let's assume that the blue player had 1 on the coordination track. They could add artillery for another d6, and so they would roll their 3 dice, and they would roll a 7 in this case. Okay, and all you will do in fire combat is basically check that to the resistance. In this case it's 7, that would be no effect. Very, very simple. In that fire combat as well, if a defender is in good order and gets a greater number against it, then it would be disorganized. If it's already disorganized, it would retreat. But fire, I don't believe, actually destroys units. It's combat. So let's show you combat the other way around. So in this case we've got d8 times 2. Let's assume there's no modifiers. So that's 6 and a 2, that's 8. The resistance of infantry is normally 4, so they would be in all sorts of trouble here. However, because they've got the tabor, that makes them an 8. So again, that would be no effect. So that's where wagons are particularly helpful in protecting infantry. So there's lots of really interesting ways that you can manipulate the map to your advantage, use units to your advantage. Some of the things on the tracks are very useful. The retreat before combat is very helpful, because when you retreat before combat, you're giving up the ground and you're forcing the enemy to move into that ground. So you can lay traps and ambushes for units on the map, which is really helpful. There's no stacking in this game, so it's nice and easy. Even though you've got these activation counters sitting on the top, you're only ever going to have 2 counters, pretty much 3 at most if you've got a wagon as well, in a square. So it's not too much to handle. This is a very small footprint game. You can see by the size of the map, but the map does give you space to maneuver and do things and lay traps, and the terrain is also quite useful, particularly for the Polish player, because in my game I found, okay, I was learning, it was a learning game, there were things that I hadn't kind of come across or worked out, but I think the terrain certainly would help the Polish player. I was a bit gung-ho with the Polish player and launched attacks off the bat and fared very badly against the Tartars, who got some very strong units. So the Polish player has got a difficult choice of, does he go for the Tartars and try and get their morale down so that they pull off the table and then he can whop up the rest? Or does he go for the blue player who's slightly weaker but got the wagons? Or does he stay defensive and try and use the terrain? The problem with the terrain is it doesn't lend itself to cavalry. So the Polish do have a couple of infantry units, but they have got 6 cavalry units, 2 infantry units. So cavalry is a big part of their force, as you would expect. The strongest units are the winged hussars under Nat Warner. They get to roll a d10 in defence and in attack. And there's different ways of looking at the way the dice mechanisms work in this. It's quite interesting because a d10 obviously does give a very big variable. You could be rolling 1s, you could be rolling 10s. Whereas a d6 maybe gives a slightly shorter variable. So the Polish winged hussars, lancers can have some fantastic results, but they can also be abysmal, which is what happened in my game, and they got overrun and destroyed quite quickly. So lots to think about, but hopefully that's just giving you a flavour. You got this little play sheet set out really nice and clearly to help you understand everything, including on the back. Tells you what each of the counters means, a little bit about the terrain. So you got everything you need here. Yeah, I hope that's giving you a bit of a flavour of how Berestechko 1651 plays. Again, this is a Snafu game. One of their newer Snafu Pocket Battle series. This is number 2, and really impressed. I think it's a lovely little travel game, fits in a small little package, but also it's a good little filler. Probably my game played in about an hour, but I'm sure once you get the hang of the game, that could probably play quite a bit quicker. There is a maximum of 2 turns to the game, so you're not talking long periods of time here. A turn can take quite a while because, of course, you're trying to activate every unit twice during a turn. So, the game does play out as you would expect over that period. But some interesting mechanics with these extras on the play aid sheets. The Tartar player trying to keep the morale up. The reorganization coordination tracks using the dice rolls, but of course you don't want to always do that. You've got 3 dice, you can only use 2 of them, so if you want to activate units, you have to work out that balance of not being able to do everything you want to do, or in fact not being able to do anything you want to do if you don't get the dice rolls to start with. So it's quite a clever little mechanic. Not seen this in games before. I always like to see new things being used, and I'm hoping we're going to see many more in this Pocket Battle series. But for now, hope you've enjoyed this short review and my feelings on the game, and look forward to seeing you all again very, very soon.